A very good evening. You draw a good crowd. Good evening. Welcome to the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It's great to see so many of you here. This is the second of this year's series of talks with artists, curators, and museum directors that we will be putting on this year as part of our modern and contemporary program. It's a great pleasure to welcome Peter Doig as our guest this evening.
Thank you.
Peter is a man of many different places. It's very hard to put his biography into a very sort of sweet nutshell. He was born in Edinburgh in Scotland, grew up between Trinidad and Canada, where his father sort of took the family because of his work. He lived between Montreal, Quebec, and Toronto. And in 1979, he moved back to Europe, to London, to study painting, two different art schools, Wimbledon and St. Martin's, and went back to Canada for a couple of years, came back to London, finished off his studies at Chelsea, and graduated in 1990. And began exhibiting regularly pretty soon after that. Was nominated for the Turner Prize in 1994, became a trustee of the Tate Gallery soon afterwards, and in the year 2000, he was invited for an artist residency in Trinidad, back in Trinidad, where he went with his great friend and fellow artist Chris Afili, and took to it and decided in 2002 to move back there and make it his primary residence. He has held a teaching position at the Fine Arts Academy in Düsseldorf since 2005 and has continued to teach long after many people in his position probably would have given up. And just to finish off the biography, there's a quote from a British critic who I normally disagree with everything that he writes, but I happen to agree with this quote. And it goes, "Amid all the nonsense, the imposters, the rhetorical bullshit and trash that pass for art in the 21st century, Peter Doig is a jewel of genuine imagination, sincere work, and humble creativity. His art will last." Which is a big statement to make in a building like this. But it's great to have you here, Peter. Thank you very much for coming. Many of the talks that you give accompany exhibitions that you're having in I'm going to move this around so I can look at you a little better. Many of the talks that you give accompany exhibitions that you're having or take place, at the very least, in museums of modern art. This is a rather different setting this evening. We are working on a project together, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I wanted really to begin this evening by talking a little bit about where we are, this museum, this collection, this building. It's often said by critics and scholars when they're writing about your work that your paintings remind people of art from another time. They manage to remain both contemporary and speak to a sort of tradition of painting at the same time. We've walked through the museum now on two separate occasions, about a year apart, and we've paused in front of certain pictures and we've talked about what you find interesting in them. And I guess to begin with, I'd really just like to ask you how you approach collections like this. How do you feel to be in a building like this? And it's a very difficult question to answer, but do you consider your work to be in some form of conversation with this great swathe of sort of art that we have in a building like this?
Probably not really. I think that my relation to a museum like this really is, I guess, to do with attraction, really. I'm not necessarily looking for like the greatest hits of this museum, although there are obvious ones here that everyone knows and I'm drawn to as well. But I'm interested in looking at, effect in painting, whoever it may be. I mean, you yourself introduced me to quite a number of paintings on the first visit that I wasn't particularly familiar with, Correggio, is that pronounced? And I was very excited to see those and to see the way they were made. So I think that, yes, of course, Caravaggio, Bruegel, Titian, but also just lots of other things that surprised you, things by people I don't know.
Was there a kind of definable moment during your studies or the early part of your career where you felt you passed beyond a sort of intimidation of certain big historical figures and you felt able to encroach on them and begin to assimilate? Was there a sort of moment where you began to look at this type of art as a resource for your work?
Well, it's interesting because when I went to art school in London in the early 80s, we had to spend a week in the National Gallery. That was part of the three things we had to do that were compulsory, other than just make paintings right from the beginning, were a week in the National Gallery, a week drawing still life, a week drawing the life model. And a few of my fellow students never left the National Gallery. They spent the 3 years in the National Gallery making copies and versions of. I made a version of a Bronzino painting, I remember, but I didn't really continue that, that sort of fascination really like others did.
And when, it's funny, I found some notes that I had made when I walked through your Tate Britain show from a few years ago, and when I think of artists who come to mind when I look at your work, I made a little list, Daumier, Courbet, Rousseau, Bonnard, Munch, Matisse, Beckmann, Hopper. They're kind of predominantly 19th century or early 20th century. And I just wondered if there was something about that particular period which is historical but not too historical, which somehow feels more available to you or accessible to you, or whether it's simply they are the first modern artists and therefore they feel...
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, that they're the first modern artists, a lot of them are the first artists that looked at the modern world through, various lenses and photography, I guess, experimented more freely with the use of material, use of color. Yeah, so I mean, I think naturally I was attracted to that rather than the more distant past.
Other artists in here that you really struggle with still? I mean, Lucian Freud thought that Raphael was just the worst artist who'd ever lived. And yeah. My struggle is Rubens. I've tried and tried and tried, and I'm so excited because we're doing a big Rubens show this autumn, and I hope it's going to be my moment to actually understand. But is there anyone in here that any of the sort of greats where you just don't find a way in? I just think there's so many that I don't really feel. I feel intimidated by really because they're such masters, as it were. The draftsmanship's so incredible. It seems almost impossible what they did, really, for me to ever sort of in a way get close to it, really. And I'm not really that interested in getting that close to it. I might be interested in a sort of a facsimile of aspects, but so I do find a lot of the work by the masters intimidating. I might find someone like Bruegel more accessible because I find the type of drawing that's involved in his work, it seems really quite real to me and sort of almost amateurish in a sense, but taken to a very, very high level of finish, because he's a great painter as well as I would say a slightly awkward draftsman. Or at least he's got his own, his style of drawing is absolutely his own. You've actually set me up perfectly because this is a gallery just over here which contains 12 paintings by Peter Bruegel the Elder, painted within a 10-year period from 1559 to 1569 when he died. And we spent a lot of time in there last time you were here. We spent a lot of time in there today. I found an old copy of Frieze magazine from a number of years ago where they did a survey of artists and critics and curators, and they asked everyone to choose 5 artworks from history that they would preserve were the world to be burning down. And this was this was actually the most popular painting in the entire survey. And it was a painting that you chose, and we spent a lot of time looking at it today. Do you remember when you encountered Bruegel for the first time?
I think I first encountered Bruegel in the real was in Berlin, when I first went to Berlin in the very early 80s, in the museum there. And I'd obviously seen paintings reproduction. There was a small crucifixion too in London, I think in the Courtauld, that was stolen. No longer is there. But it wasn't until I came to Vienna maybe 20 odd years ago that I saw these paintings. But this is a painting, when I got interested in making paintings using, the idea of snow, this is a painting I obviously looked at.
It's funny you talk about reproductions. Bacon always said that he only found the old masters accessible through reproduction, through postcards. He claimed that he made all of his popes from a postcard of the great Velasquez and the Doria Pamphili, but he never saw the real thing. And he didn't ever want the pressure of standing in front of the real thing. He just wanted a torn out page from a catalogue or something. It sort of made it more...
Because you can invent the surface for your own, in your own way, I guess.
One thing that I find really fascinating about Bruegel is that on the face of it, people think of a painting like this as being wonderfully reassuring. He's one of the first painters of everyday life, who sort of invented this genre painting. And there's something normal, there's a sense of tranquility. That's the sort of first burn most people get from Bruegel. But when you begin to spend time with them, for me at least, a completely conflicting emotion comes in very quickly soon afterwards, which is something completely sinister, something completely dark, something completely unstable. And this reassuring normality, tranquility is completely vanished about 2 minutes into looking at the pictures. It reminds me of Giorgio de Chirico a little bit, who paints these, with an urban equivalent, but scenes which look sort of relatively harmless, and then you begin to spend time with them and they're completely sort of creepy. I often feel something, we talked about this picture of yours today. This is a painting called Grande Rivière from 2001, 2002. And I've had the chance to stand in front of this picture a couple of times, and the scene feels completely recognizable. There's a plot. We've got identifiable characters. This awkward old horse on a beach surrounded by vultures. But at the same time, it's completely foreign. It's full of loose ends and half-related things. And as a result, the whole picture is very unstable somehow. It's not still. Is this sort of in-betweenness something that you look for in your work?
Well, I suppose it's interesting seeing this after looking at the Bruegel. My painting seems very unfinished. My paintings seem very unfinished. I think he was able to achieve a level of finish that is very enviable, and also, still create an incredible mood over the whole composition, and a lasting mood too. You can see the painting hundreds and hundreds of times, and it doesn't go away. I suppose that is something that one hopes to achieve, is to create some sort of atmosphere, mood that doesn't go away with subsequent lookings. First of all yourself, then whoever else may see it. Yes, there is a narrative. Yes, there is. I was referring to specific things I'd seen and that I found interesting, and maybe things that I'd found quite haunting, or slightly morbid in a way. But the most important thing, I suppose, in realizing the painting and the subject of the painting is to try and create atmosphere, whatever that is.
We were looking at this cow in a Bruegel painting today, one of the seasons, and it's just one of the most awful cows ever painted, but it's utterly believable. And I'm not saying that your horse here is so terrible, but you in interviews you've given, you really belittle your own draftsmanship, I've noticed. You say that it's often the sort of most obviously figurative element of a work that takes you the most time and you struggle with, and yet it's utterly convincing and it fits at the same time. And I mean, there's good awkwardness and there's bad awkwardness, and this feels very much like good awkwardness, if that's not too kind of stupid a thing to say.
Well, I was glad to see the cow in the Bruegel painting, and yes, it was a bad cow, but maybe that's an example of, in a way, there's lots of elements in his paintings that are slightly off, but the whole thing works together.
One thing that we spoke a little bit about today, this is a really wonderful, huge painting. It's about 3.5 meters across. This is a painting called Echo Lake from 1998. This often happens in your works, that you have these incredibly sort of timeless scenes, and then there's a single sort of object in there which anchors it in today. So the police car and the policeman, it's like when you have a wonderful alpine scene and there's a snowboarder which kind of drags you back into where we are. When I've stood in front of this painting before, I find myself in a kind of push and pull constantly. I find myself stepping back to see what you've painted, and then I feel myself stepping forward to see how you've painted it. And it's almost as if there's a wonderful book that's just come out on Bruegel by a guy called Joseph Kerner, an American art historian. And he talks about Bruegel deliberately making pictures to be seen from two different vantage points. A sort of panoramic view. He gives the example of this picture, Children's Games, where you're obliged to step back to take in the sort of totality. And Bruegel was great friends with all of these map makers in Antwerp who taught him how to lay out as much information as possible on a picture plane and still make it readable. And then you have to go in to see the actual detail and then zoom out again. And when I look at a picture like this of yours, is this idea of getting lost, you've spoken quite a lot about this idea of getting lost in a picture, disoriented, physically lost in a picture. Could you maybe speak a little bit about that idea of disorientation in your work?
This painting was actually inspired by a painting by Edvard Munch called Ashes, which is actually a painting of a woman with red hair with her hands up, holding her head, looking out across a lake that you only see the foreground of, but in a sense the idea of the lake is suggested and places the viewer back, and I think I tried to echo that. The foreground I also took almost color-wise from this particular Munch painting. The face of the figure is quite developed, but also quite vacant, so I think that it kind of draws you in. It's almost like a kind of siren in a way, or that was the idea. And I don't know, there was enough I felt there had to be enough information to draw you in, but also that you could actually see it from afar. Does that answer it?
Yeah, no, I didn't really have a follow-up to that. I mean, this was an incredibly important painting in your career. This is a painting called Blotter from 1993. When we talk about Bruegel, there's lots of other things which I find really interesting. You talked about the policeman's face being quite developed, but that feels to me like quite a rarity. You have quite a way of often populating your paintings with people with creating mood without any sort of decipherable expression. So you lure us in, but actually when I go in, I'm looking at the different way you're laying paint down on the canvas rather than, and Bruegel often just has, I mean, he'll even use carnival masks deliberately, almost to kind of shield, to completely remove any sort of human expression from it. Or you opt for the silhouette sometimes. It's a sort of, yeah, I think it's, most people, most artists, when they're trying to create mood, almost the first thing they would use to engage in mood construction would be the facial expression. So I think
I think this was what was more important for me in this painting was the body language, really, and it's actually pretty nondescript, really. But I mean, except the fact that I know the person very well, and I know the way they stand, and that was important to me. And I think important also for the atmosphere I wanted for the painting, really, something that was actually kind of contemplative and still, almost bland, really. And yet the painting is very, very active.
Yeah.
The painting was, you know, in a way, the actual painting was maybe meant to represent more the state of mind, whereas the actual attitude was quite still and quite quiet.
This is one of my favorite paintings of yours. It's called Figure in a Mountain Landscape from 1997. And you also have a lot of pictures in which figures are seen from the back, and they almost become a sort of key part of the landscape themselves. The figure becomes the landscape becomes the figure. And Bruegel was also one of the very first people ever to paint the backs of people. There's full paintings just populated by the backs of people, and it's completely fascinating. This is a picture which we talked about today. This is Ski Jacket from 1994 in the collection of Tate's today. And this is a picture where I always think of Bruegel every single time. His snow is so colorful. I mean, it's more monochrome than this, but was an artist like that very much at the forefront of your mind when you were painting? I mean, obviously this is referring back to Canada and childhood and so on, but I mean, winter and snow as a sort of recurrent motif in your work comes back to something in the history of painting?
I'd resisted, up until this point in time as a painter, I'd kind of resisted painting things that I like doing. Like, well, some of the things I like doing, like leisure activities, like skiing, being in the snow, those sorts of things. I thought they would be, far too whimsical to be kind of serious subject for a painting. And in fact, this painting came about because I saw a photograph in a newspaper, and yes, I was reminded of Bruegel, all these little figures, all these kind of beginner skiers struggling to sort of find their feet in the snow, but also I was also kind of reminded of Oriental painting, the way that, and actually Bruegel does the same thing, whereas there's focus from almost top to bottom, really, side to side, and that's where that came from.
I mean, it's easy to look at this now, and it's become quite an iconic painting, but 1994, this must have shocked, this must have been deeply unfashionable. This must have shocked. I mean, this is when, people are cutting up cows and, and you're painting a winter landscape. I mean...
Yeah, I mean, I hardly...
Did you get a hard time from people for...
Hardly shocking, but... but maybe people wondered why someone would be interested in making paintings like this, or making paintings that, in a way, refer to these things, or soft paintings, or... maybe the idea of a beautiful painting. I wouldn't say shocking, but I would say sort of, people maybe scratch their heads and wonder why someone would spend their time doing that.
I remember once hearing you say that you were invited for a group exhibition and people were sort of almost reluctant to be sharing the same room as you because of some of these... Was it this sort of time?
Excuse me. Yeah, it was just before this time, and I think that it's hard to remember what it was like. But I mean, painting was very unfashionable, and particularly painting that depicted things, and maybe paintings that were where the subject was construed as being, I don't know, not hardcore or serious or whatever that may be.
This is actually my favorite of all these winter scenes. This is a painting called Coburg 3+1 More from the same year as Ski Jacket. And this is, in some ways, the most sort of impenetrable of all of them because you actually have this sort of device of the screen. Bruegel wrote about one of his painting in London of the Three Kings, where it's actually snowing, as what he was after with having actual physical snow falling rather than just lying on the ground was to make, anchor the painting in the present rather than to make it eternal. It's performative somehow, which I think is what's so interesting about this piece. This brings us on to the project that we're doing together. In about a year from now, we're going to be presenting a group exhibition here in the Kunsthistorisches, which will bring in 25 extraordinary artworks from 1800 to today, so the period that we're missing as a museum. So for about 3 months only, we will be a museum that goes through to the present day. And it begins in the 19th century with some quite well-known artists, Turner and Cézanne and Manet, some less well-known artists like Wilhelm Hammershøi, and it continues up through the 20th century with Marcel Duchamp, Claude Cahun, Mark Rothko, Ronnie Horn, Steve McQueen. And one thing that we talked about this today, but one thing we've shied away from doing in this museum over the last couple of years is doing any direct juxtapositions of old and new. Lucian Freud didn't want his work to hang next to old things, but he wanted it to be near, in the vicinity of. But next year, we've chosen these 25 objects precisely because of their affinities with objects in the collection. So the exhibition will be hung in the Egyptian galleries, in the Greek and Roman galleries, in the Kunstkammer, and in the picture gallery. It's going to be an exhausting exhibition to visit for everyone. And to kind of finish the show, we've commissioned 3 living artists to create new works for the exhibition. The photographer Catherine Opie. We have a lot of women in the show. I think half the show is women, which is unheard of in this institution. We have a lot of media which didn't exist when this collection was being film, photography. We have artists from not from Europe, which is also something that we don't really have here. We have artists from Indonesia and Pakistan and Israel. And we've invited 3 artists to produce new works for the show. Cathy Opie is responding to the history of German portraiture. Kerry James Marshall is painting his own version of Tintoretto's Susanna and the Elders. And I gave you a choice of, I think, a dozen artists or so, and you chose Bruegel. And without sort of giving too much away, could you maybe speak a little bit about how you're approaching this? Because this is a pretty perfect gallery. And we walked around today thinking, how on earth do you land in here? And how do you paint a piece which is, or do you just simply not think too much about it? How are you going about this?
Well, that's a good question. It's obviously an incredible challenge and honor as well to be asked. I don't know if I can put a painting in that room. Everyone knows the room upstairs. Maybe it will go in the little chamber next door. The Bruegel paintings are quite small, I think. Don't think I'm particularly successful at making paintings of that size. So I'd have to I'm making something bigger. I've already started it. I mean, in many ways, it refers to the winter paintings, but I don't know. How does one do it? I mean, what level of finish do you get up to? I mean, his paintings are so finished. My paintings are not. There's so much detail in his paintings, right down from the foreground to the background. Mine maybe operate in similar ways, but they're very differently painted. I don't know. It's a surprise. I mean, maybe I'll fall flat on my face, but it's worth trying.
I mean, the whole show might fall flat on its face, because we've never done these it may just go up in flames and be the worst exhibition that anyone's ever seen, because we're putting Rothko with Rembrandt, we're putting Felix González Torres with Tullio Lombardo downstairs. So it could either be amazing or just ghastly. One thing that we spoke about today, you mentioned once that when you painted a series of works in Trinidad, in a particular type of light, where colors register differently, there's a vibrancy to daily life there, and you brought them over to London for an exhibition at Tate. The palette suddenly registered as something much, hallucinogenic almost. This is a different situation, but you're dealing with paintings which are 450 years old with very muted tones. It's sort of, that room feels very autumnal. Is that something you take into account when you're, or can you not allow that to be taken into account because it'll lead you in a wrong direction? Or?
I don't know. I mean, I think that aspects of the level of focus and color that actually is, I think, very intense in Bruegel, I'll have to take as a challenge, really, because otherwise, I think my paintings could end up looking like sort of muted wallpaper, and I wouldn't want that to be. So I'll have to, yeah, attempt it. I mean, I think I have made some paintings that have got very high color and high contrast in the past. Not so much recently, but I think I'll have to go back to that, really.
One thing that we're going to get to some newer works later. I realize that I'm showing a lot of older works tonight. One thing that really intrigues me about your work, whenever I see it, is you have a sort of propensity to very deliberately flirt with danger, or with what people might consider to be things that are almost taboo. And you flirt with them just long enough for it to be a sort of lure, and for this awkwardness that we were talking to sort of creep in. I've got a few examples. There's the choice of subject matter, which we've talked a little bit about before. There's your interest in what might be perceived as the romantic or the nostalgic. We talked today about beauty and the notion of beauty, the notion of the decorative, or using the decorative. I mean, these are words which people find almost dirty words. You dismiss something as decorative, as traditional, or something. And I find your engagement with them, or even your palette that you're using, I think it's really fascinating how you stray into areas that are, dangerous is the wrong word, but potentially leading you into problematic places just far enough for this awkwardness to come in. Is that something that is that just an art historian reading too much into this, or is this straying close to things, like take decoration, for example, that wonderful painting, Architect's House in the Ravine?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's maybe more straightforward than that. I think maybe it's more just finding the right way to work a painting for the particular painting. And then if I find that I do that too often, I change. Like, I mean, with the Architect's Home in the Ravine, you know, I was quite excited by this idea of creating this sort of web, or this idea of looking through things, keeping the viewer away from the picture by using, you know, paint. Kind of similar in a way to, like, maybe Pollock did it with his drips. But this was actually done in a very sort of actual, sort of quite physical way. And then I found that after I made a few paintings like that, I found it was becoming a bit divisive, and I would open up the pictures to make something maybe like the other painting, which is far more open, as a challenge to me, really. So much of it is just to do with it comes about just during the making of the painting, and what happens in the studio, really, and what happens when I do something and then erase it and then start again, or scratch back, and I don't know.
How long do you give a painting to? Do you give a painting do you sit with it for a long time in the studio? Go back to it. You're often working on several things at the same time.
Well, if you put the next painting on, that one, yeah. I mean, this painting, for instance, I started it, and it very much surprised me, because I hadn't really made a painting like this before. I started it, and I probably worked on it for about 2 days, and I just left it. And I left it for maybe, I don't know, 8 months or so, and just did tiny little bits to it, and didn't really know how to finish it. But I also knew I didn't want to finish it. I didn't want to sort of really finish it. So I just ended up just adding a little bit of paint to the face and the hand, and then that seemed to be enough for me, really. But I think if I hadn't had that amount of time I would have been, I would have either abandoned it or done something very different, turned it into something more.
Done too much to it.
Done too much to it, maybe. You know, in retrospect, I'm glad I left it the way I did. And then I made another version of the same painting where I actually did a lot more to it. Maybe this is the more successful one.
I think that's why I chose this one. I think it's absolutely of this whole group. I don't want to talk for any great length about the market for your works, and I know very well that you don't either. But there's one aspect of success as an artist that I am sort of curious to talk to you about. When I was younger, I lived in the house next door to Lucian Freud, and I was lucky enough to go into his studio quite often, and I had a friendship with him, and we used to exchange letters through each other's letterboxes, and he kind of humored me, shall we say, with my kind of annoying questions and my exam questions that I would ask him the answers to and stuff. And one day my grandfather told me that one of his paintings was going to be sold at an auction house, and it was supposed to break the world record for a living artist, and would I like to come? So I went to an auction house for the first time in my life, and this painting by Lucian broke the world record for a living artist. I mean, it was something laughable like £5 million back then, but that's when that was just more money than I could even comprehend. Still is, but...
Hope so.
And I thought about this all the way home. I thought not about who bought it, who sold it, this auction house with all these beautiful people. I thought about, what does Lucian think of this? And I asked my grandfather, who was driving me home, I said, you know, I want to ask him. He was, just leave him alone. He said, no, I want to ask him. So I got home about 10 o'clock at night, and I wrote a letter. And I said, dear Lucian, I've just been at the sale of your painting. Do you feel A? I gave him a multiple choice question because I was a kind of arrogant little schoolboy. I said, do you feel A, vindicated that your talent has been recognized on the world stage, or B, terrified because the next time you pick up a paintbrush, you've got to paint £5 million worth of painting? Please tell me how you feel. Yours, Jasper. And I put it through his letterbox about 10 o'clock at night. This is someone who got out of bed at about 10 o'clock at night. And my grandfather said, you're such an idiot, you're never going to get a reply. And literally 15 minutes later, our letterbox fluttered, and this kind of letter came through the door.
A brick.
Yeah, brick, yeah, like petrol bomb, came through the door. And for someone who had such a good grasp of composition, he had the most terrible handwriting, and it was all scrunched up into the top of the paper. And it said, I wrote it down because I found the letter the other day. Dear Jasper, thank you for your letter. In all honesty, I felt mildly indifferent, as if I had overheard that my great-aunt had been invited to breakfast by a group of cannibals. Yours, Lucian. And I read this letter about 6 times, like, what does he mean? What does he mean? What does that mean? And I asked my grandfather, he's like, he's telling you he doesn't care. He doesn't care. And we know he does care, because Lucian would be on the telephone to someone at the auction house, getting every bid. So he really did care. But you've spoken quite publicly about your anguish at some of the ridiculous prices that your paintings have gone for, about losing a slight sort of control over your identity and what you represent. My question at the end of this very long anecdote is, how do you block out I mean, living in Trinidad helps, but how do you block out the noise, you know? I know you have telephones and newspapers and things to Trinidad, but how do you just block out the noise? Because there is I mean, you pull crowds, and you're a painter who spends time in the studio, and does it, how do you not let it affect you?
Well, it sounds silly to say, but I think when you're in the studio, you're confronted with your work and your work only, really, and that's it, and you just have to get on with it. It doesn't make it any easier. Probably makes you a little bit less, hesitate a little bit more, maybe. I don't know. It did anyway. Kind of coming to terms with it now more. I suppose block out is. How do you block it out? You can't really block it out, but you can just try not to think about it. I mean, what else can I say, really? I mean, the worrying thing to me was in the local newspaper in Trinidad. There's three kind of good local newspapers. There's one sort of like real rag. What do you call it? Like
we have a few of them here as well.
Well, everywhere. And on the front page of the newspaper, there was a picture of my painting. This was completely not in context of any auction that had just happened. It was one that had happened some years ago, and it just said, Paramin, which is the area where I live, artist sells painting for, X amount of whatever it was, translated into Trinidad dollars, which is, would buy people several boats or whatever, massive boats. I don't know.
As if that money had gone to you.
Well, I mean, just like that, and I just suddenly thought, oh God, people are going to come sort of knocking at my door and or worse things.
I was going to say new alarm system on the house. And
well, just became. I felt kind of worried, but no one's ever approached me or anything. But that would be my fear, or if it affected my family.
You said that one of the reactions that you had to this sort of development in your career was almost an instinct to try to make paintings that people wouldn't even want to buy. Was that just...
No, I discussed...
Because I find that really fascinating.
No, I discussed it with...
I mean, your gallerist is here, I don't know, but...
Well, I actually discussed it with Michael Werner shortly afterwards, and I was, because it was a phenomena, even within the artists in the gallery. I mean, some very, very, very senior artists. And he said, well, what can you do? There's nothing you can do. He said, you can try and make paintings. His suggestion is that people won't want to buy. He said, but you'll never be able to escape it. So you just have all you can do is carry on. So,
I mean, we've been looking at pictures in a museum all day that are open to everyone. You buy a ticket, you come in here. It's wonderful when works you make are acquired directly by museums, and hopefully your works will all one day end up in a museum, but do you, I guess it's kind of easy also to lose track of them at a certain point. At the beginning you would have known where everything was. They were going to friends or fellow artists or early collectors, and now it's sort of they somehow feel as if they disappear into an ever somehow.
Well, I suppose if you're an artist like myself who doesn't make so many paintings, and if you are offered an exhibition in a good venue, and then a quarter of your paintings or an eighth of your paintings or whatever, you don't know where they are, or you have no idea who owns them, and you can't borrow them, that can be problematic, especially when they're paintings you consider to be some of your best. It would almost be like a singer who gets an offer to sing on a big stage and then can't sing the songs that they've sold to other people type thing, or other people own that you don't own the rights to anymore. So that is problematic.
One thing I'd love to talk to you a little bit about is your relationship with Vienna. You've spent time here over the years. You spent a sort of slightly extended period of time. This is a painting called House of Pictures from 2000, 2002. This is a building a lot of you will recognize. It's on the Breite Gasse, almost opposite Hubert Winter's gallery, where the Sammlung Klevan is normally housed. Can you talk a little bit about Vienna, what you've been doing here over the years, and how you find it here as a sort of climate and place to work? Or...
Well, I only worked here for one summer in an artist who's here tonight, who teaches at has a class at the Kunstakademie, Erwin Bohach. And it came about through my good friend Eric Bartz, who's from Vienna. And he suggested that maybe I should try and work in Vienna, because I'd been in an exhibition at the Kunsthalle called Alpenblick. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Curated by a gentleman called Wolfgang Koos, who put together I thought a very interesting exhibition about, works that reflected the Alpine, whether they be photographs, films. Anyway, so that's where my relationship with Vienna started, I guess.
How was it? Were you able to work here?
It was very, very hot. I remember it was in the summer. It was like unbelievably hot. Spent quite a few long mornings on the Donauinsel, either rollerblading around or swimming there. and then would work in the afternoons. And I don't know how many paintings I finished, but I started a lot here and took them back to London and subsequently finished them. House to Builder, or House of Pictures as I called it, was a picture gallery, I think, nearby where the studio was I was working. I'm not sure exactly where it is geographically to here. I never actually went in. It was never open. It wasn't open in the summer that I was there. But I looked in the window, and it seemed to have all these different paintings of different genres, and that very much intrigued me, along with the sort of, I thought, quite sort of mysterious signage.
This is the collection which is now on exhibition at the Lower Belvedere, the Salmon Clave. And we talked today about those slightly painful texts that appear in auction catalogues when your paintings are sold. And with all due respect to people from auction houses who are here this evening, auction houses are trying to sell pictures when they're writing about them, and they always use lots of comparative images, like that Bruegel Hunters in the Snow always pops up in a picture. Klimt is someone who often is thrown out by people as if there's some sort of affinity. This is a painting from 1902 called Buchenwald. Is he someone that you have looked at, you continue to look at? Did he register on you at a certain point?
I think, yeah, I mean, like late 80s, early 90s, I was very interested in the kind of, you know, the broken surface of Klimt. Not just Klimt, I mean, lots of different artists, but yeah, and just the strange compositions. I mean, obviously, Klimt, there's a lot of breadth to what Klimt made in his life, but for me, I was interested in his landscapes, really. I mean, I suppose I was looking at, you know, different devices that he used that I could sort of incorporate in my own work.
I think this is an amazing painting. I mean, I love Klimt's landscapes almost more than, actually I love Schiele's landscapes more than even his figures, which I know I'm probably going to get fired for saying in this country, but yeah. And Schiele and Kokoschka and people, did they come into your imagination at a certain point?
Not so much. I mean, of course, I appreciate them, but not so much. It was more Klimt, and particularly these Klimts. I mean, I think the trees in that I painted in Blotter, the birch trees, were very influenced by these, as much as they were by real birch trees.
I've got two more questions for you, and I just want to cycle through a couple more pictures. These are just pictures which I thought I couldn't not show tonight, because they're three of the pictures that I think are the most extraordinary you've done. This is a painting called Man Dressed as Bat from 2007. This is a painting called Black Curtain Towards Monkey Island from 2004. And this is probably my favorite. I've said that about 3 times tonight, but this is one of my favorite pictures of yours called, and someone's going to correct my German pronunciation here. Can you say this properly?
Probably not. I can say Gasthof.
Gasthof. Yeah, we'll call it Gasthof. Gasthof zur Muldentalsperre. From 2000-2002. And because we've seen a lot of older works, this is one of your more recent works that I think is really, really wonderful. This is Balcony, North Coast from 2013. I guess this is your deck in Trinidad, or? No?
Somewhat.
Okay, somewhat. I guess I wanted to finish by basically asking you a very simple question, which is probably very hard to answer. You've been painting now for almost 40 years. What has got harder for you during that time, and what has got easier? Or do you have the same struggles?
I just think it goes in waves. I mean, if I think back over the last 40 years, I think there's times when I feel extremely sort of full of ideas and extremely inspired just to sort of to make things and just to try things out. And there's other times when I feel more reticent and slower. And I think that I used to sort of worry about that, but I actually think it's just natural to me to be like that. Really, I'm not someone who can just you know, work fluidly every day. It doesn't come naturally to me. I don't have a practice like the artists you mentioned, say Lucian Freud, who, you know, has a studio, has a room. Someone comes into the room, he paints them, and then someone else comes to the room at different times of the day. I've never, in a way, been a 9 to 5 or, you know, 12 till midnight type artist. It's just I have to be inspired to paint, and I have to have fresh ideas. And I don't really. I find if I kind of really look hard for things, it almost goes in the other direction. It's things that come to me just by, without me wanting to find them, that are the most pertinent. And some of the paintings that I think I've made most recently that are the most pertinent to me are things that came about very unexpectedly. And then it's the whole process of trying to figure out how to make the painting for that particular. It's pretty, it's quite frustrating, really. But once I get into it, then I think I find it very rewarding.
I have the feeling that you spend more time thinking about what to paint rather than actually painting.
Yeah, possibly, or just like not really knowing how to do it, or starting something and then rejecting it. But once you get into, as I say, once I get into the flow of it, when that comes, it's very rewarding, and it's almost like that's when you get into almost like a sort of timeless zone, and that to me is the best bit.
One final question. There's probably 100 students here this evening from the Academy and from the Angewandte. You teach yourself in Düsseldorf. You're going on there tomorrow. Very hard question, but you, I think, fortunately, didn't have success at a very early point in your career. You've had wonderful success since, but you had, or you gave yourself time to work out what was going on, find your voice. What is the sort of thing you find yourself repeating to your students in Düsseldorf who are sort of in a hurry or about to graduate? How are you, what would you pass on to some of these guys this evening?
Well, I don't think that I necessarily gave myself time. I think that was just what happened. I mean, I think that if, as a 25-year-old, I'd been offered exhibitions, I would have probably jumped at the chance, but the fact of the matter was I wasn't. It didn't really come till much later for me. And I think if I consider what I was doing in those years, I'm glad that didn't happen in retrospect. But how would I have known? I would have no idea what I would have made later on. So I think in regards to my own students, I mean, depending on each one, they're all so different, really. I mean, some of them seem very ready and very mature, and in a way should be encouraged to, if they have the opportunity to go for it. Other ones, I would just say, take your time, really. It's as simple as that.